Inflation has driven up the cost of so much, and with high interest rates and high home prices, the economy is paramount to voters when it comes to choosing the next president. I'm John Dorman, and I'm a senior politics reporter at Business Insider. Here's how the U.S. economy will look like under a Biden or a Trump presidency. Education is one of the most critical issues of this election, especially with younger voters. One of the issues that both candidates have brought up is reform in higher education overall. Student loan debt has broad implications for the American economy. Whether it comes to delaying buying a home or not being able to afford buying a car, it really could have major implications on the life choices of millions of Americans. So even if you aren't particularly affected by student loan debt relief, higher education overall, especially for young generations, this is going to be a continued issue with education costs continuing to rise. Should President Joe Biden be reelected, he would continue to find ways to try to lower costs for students when paying back student loans. Whereas for former President Donald Trump, he's given no indication that that's something that would be a priority of his. President Joe Biden has been a firm supporter of broader student loan debt relief. It's an issue that he ran on in 2020.
Middle-class folks earn under 125 grand, you get up to $10,000 knocked off the debt, and if you earn under 125 grand, you receive a Pell Grant, you get a $20,000 knocked off.
And it was an issue that brought in a lot of younger voters to his campaign, but it has hit a lot of snags. While he has implemented about $153 billion of relief for students, especially those that were impacted by the closure of for-profit universities, there have been a lot of court challenges. Former President Donald Trump and Republicans have been opponents of student loan debt relief.
President Biden is not allowed to wipe out hundreds and hundreds of billions, probably trillions of dollars in student loan debt.
And should he be back in the White House, is something that he wouldn't implement. When it comes to healthcare, we should consider abortion, gender-affirming healthcare, and drug prices. Should President Joe Biden be reelected, he would continue to implement the firm mechanics of the Affordable Care Act, where with former President Donald Trump, he has been an opponent of the Affordable Care Act.
We're going to repeal it, and we're going to replace it, and we're going to get you great health care at a fraction of the cost.
And he also has been a candidate who hasn't really focused particularly on pharmaceutical drugs, something that the Biden administration has firmly been a supporter of negotiating.
If he succeeds and Obamacare is overturned, 20 million lose coverage, 100 million lose the coverage for pre-existing conditions. Pregnancy once again becomes a pre-existing condition. Your kids won't be able to stay in your plan until they're 26.
President Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act lowered the cost of insulin to $35 a month, and his administration is committed to negotiating drug prices with drug companies. Whereas the former President Donald Trump, it's slightly unclear how he would approach lowering the cost of prescription drugs, which is a major issue for seniors in this election. Abortion is a defining issue for the presidential campaigns. For President Joe Biden, he's running as a pro-choice candidate. He is committed to restoring Roe v. Wade, and he's railed against former President Donald Trump over the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade.
A terrible, extreme decision, in my view, upending lives and impacting on the health and safety of millions of women.
Former President Donald Trump, he installed the justices that were able to overturn Roe v. Wade, and he's been a firm supporter of that decision. However, he does say that he won't support a national abortion ban, which is something that the Biden administration questions.
The choice is clear. We either elect federal senators and representatives who will codify Roe, or Republicans who will elect the House and Senate who will try to ban abortions nationwide.
When it comes to gender-affirming healthcare, President Biden does support gender-affirming care overall, while former President Donald Trump doesn't support federal funding of gender-affirming care. Here's where President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump stand on the issue of taxes. Biden's tax plans have been focused on delivering relief for middle-class taxpayers, whereas former President Donald Trump's plans have been more focused on higher-income earners.
We passed the largest tax cuts in the history of our country. The Democrats want to raise your taxes. Tell me about that.
With inflation still being a major issue, the plans for both of these candidates could have major implications in terms of filing taxes, but just in terms of everyday costs that are passed on. But overall, the picture for both candidates is still a little uncertain. Here's where Biden and Trump stand on the issue of labor. President Joe Biden has been a major ally of organized labor. The infrastructure law was something that was championed by the administration, and organized labor was thrilled by that, created hundreds of thousands of jobs.
I've created nearly 13.5 million jobs, more jobs in 2 years than any president has created in a 4-year term.
If Biden is reelected, organized labor will continue to be a huge priority for him. President Biden's stance on unions has been basically to implement and to strengthen protections for workers, which has broad implications for whether it's overtime pay or whether how prevailing wages are calculated. This is something that his administration has prioritized. Whereas for former President Donald Trump, he's made overtures and tried to make inroads with auto unions and labor overall, but it's unclear whether he was going to have success with that in the second term. The issue of affordable housing is a huge one for millions of Americans, and it's something that both President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump would have to tackle heavily in a second term, especially when it comes to young voters who have found themselves priced out of so many cities and towns across the country. When it comes to Biden, in the past, he's kickstarted the construction of 1.7 million new units, which is something that he feels as though has helped alleviate the problem. In a second term, he would continue with that. Whereas for Donald Trump, he hasn't been too clear on how he would actually tackle the issue of affordable housing. Both Biden and Trump are going to need the votes of millennials and Gen Zers in the upcoming election, especially as it comes to housing affordability, which is something that could be the difference between winning or losing key swing states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Manufacturing is going to be a key issue in this election. Manufacturing has broad implications for the American economy, especially as it relates to the expansion of this industry when it comes to costs being higher. These are all things that are passed on to American consumers. A strong and healthy manufacturing sector in America is something that both Biden and Trump want, and they both also have different approaches to how they want to tackle that. For Biden, he's focused on lowering the cost of electric vehicles, whereas for former President Donald Trump, he's been more skeptical of EVs, saying that it will harm the U.S. auto industry and that Mexico and China would have a competitive edge there. Another important issue is the policies between Biden and Trump when it comes to steel. Biden has fought to keep steel domestically owned. He has not put any additional regulations on it. Whereas for Trump, when he was in office, he placed tariffs on steel and aluminum imports. When it comes to manufacturing, you also have to consider their stance on the environment. Biden has crafted many of his regulations with the environment in mind. He sought to tighten pollution standards for vehicles. Whereas for former President Donald Trump, he's been someone who wants to invest more in fossil fuels and has been opposed to the restrictions when it comes to auto pollution. Since their stances are so wildly divergent, this is an issue that is going to be huge for a lot of voters. In a second term, Biden is really going to be focused on strengthening the sorts of regulations when it comes to vehicle production, whereas with Trump, you're going to see a relaxation of those sorts of rules. And you're going to see more power companies have more influence within that particular administration. Here's where Biden and Trump have positioned themselves on the issue of trade and tariffs. Tariffs and trade have major implications for American taxpayers. With inflation already being so rampant, the costs of everyday goods rising through protectionist policies and other strict trade policies could be really, really detrimental to a lot of Americans. In 2016, Trump ran on more protectionist trade policies.
We're going to defend our workers, protect our jobs, and finally, put America first.
Is how he made inroads in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. In a second term, he would likely continue those, especially as it relates to tariffs against China and other trade and protectionist policies that he's spoken about heavily with his America First stance, especially as it relates to strengthening domestic manufacturing. Biden in years past has been supportive of free trade, but there's been a shift in his administration over the past few years. Recently, he's implemented tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from China. That's a big thing that could have really broad implications going forward. And it also mirrors some of the more protectionist policies that were put into place by Trump. With inflation having ravaged the pocketbooks of so many Americans over the past few years, issues of tariffs and trade for both Biden and Trump are going to be something that voters are going to be paying close attention to. The economy is by far the most important issue on the minds of voters headed into the election. Whether it is student loan debt relief, whether it's manufacturing, tariffs, and trade, voters are going to want solutions, and they're going to be demanding that from the candidates.